Hello, hello, everyone. I do not know if you're aware that the greatest language in the world is love, and that love is the language the blind eyes can see and the deaf ears can hear. And I speak English right now, which is my second language. I speak Norwegian, and to be honest, I am not the best person when it comes to languages. My wife is much better than me. Then I also have a couple of my friends. One of them is Supresa, who we were just with. I think he speaks about 14 languages. I have a couple of other ones that speaks 8 or 9 different languages. But one of the things that I have been committed to, and I've done that since my baptism of love, it is to learn the language of love. It is a language that I've learned how to practice. You have to learn the ABC of that language, like you have to learn any other language. But even as I started to learn it, to be able to speak it in different culture and different settings, and this is connected to the very topic that we're going to talk about today at Kingdom Family Talk. And that has to do a little bit with covert revival. You may be familiar with overt revival. I don't know if you're familiar with, if that was back in my days when you had the 4 spiritual laws, or we had evangelism explosion, or you had different ways where we presented the gospel. If that was presentation evangelism, we were sharing the good news and knocking on doors or going out to be able to making sure that people through, if you can use it, just intellectual conversation, that we were going to try to talk them into the kingdom. And later on, I learned about power evangelism, and then presence evangelism and servant evangelism. There's so many different evangelism, until I also learned that sometimes it is the overt way that what we do it, meaning that we're going out there, and I believe in that. Believe it with all my heart. That's part of the reason we do these citywide evangelistic events. I continue to share the gospel in any ways that I need. But I started to learn in December of '89, after my baptism of love, that sometimes when I did not have what it took to be able to connect to some groups of people, I didn't have the trust level just to go to somebody, if you could say it in a way where they were maybe what we call from a 0 is when they are ready to receive Jesus, to a -10. Somebody that could be an atheist, that could be a communist, it could be a radical Muslim. And then usually, as I'm saying, that what we learned is how do you take them to move them closer towards where they're ready to receive Jesus. And on the plus side, if you take this one on the minus side, 0 is when they're ready to receive Jesus, and they've received Jesus, all the way to a Jesus, which is +10. How do you go through that process? And I learned that, yes, power evangelism is often a way that you move much quicker in this. But it was time that I didn't have a chance to be able to give a word of knowledge, or they were not even open for me to pray. Or I maybe didn't even have a setting I could talk about it, because I was in certain culture setting. And we're living in a country right now where we are in a post-Christian culture. So how do we deal with a lot of the issues that's going on, where there is a war against identity? Actually, there's so much of us against them. And in the middle of all of that, we have a tendency to actually speak a different language, including I had a specialist who is a very dear friend who has done a podcast with us, Stephen Robertson, who has become very, very precious to me, who shared a little bit about Gen Z. And I learned, as we talked about Gen Z, the next generation, my heart was broken because I realized I don't understand their language. He wrote a book they call The Alien Among You, which is pretty much that the Gen Z has become like alien among us. But if you do not know how to connect to them, you become the alien among them. And you have this whole generation right now. They have not said no to Jesus, but they have not met a whole lot of people that know how to speak their language and how to connect to them. And he said that there was this 8-second rule. What we used to believe is that you have about 8 seconds to connect with a Gen Z, which was very different than my generation. He said, no, you have 8 seconds to go through their filter system, and they either like you or dislike you, and they move you on the outside. So when you are in a setting where a lot of people have prejudice and with a lot of mess going on with Christianity in America and around the world, and people even have a view about what Christianity is all about. And then you have the whole war within Christianity, where people have to choose between which one is good and bad on the branches of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And we have chosen what is good, and everybody else is bad. And then you're dealing with everything from liberal theology to people that And on the other side has become cessationist, and you have all the different things where there's such a, even within what's supposed to be family. Christianity as an orphanage, you have orphans all over that are still in there, arguing with one another, fighting with one another. And as a result of that, it has discredited a world that is on the outside, that is actually perishing. And then there's a lot of people that believe they will not even perish because universalism has come in. And many of them, again, they have not experiencing a God that looks like Jesus. So my heart and my passion with this little is to recognize in the post-Christian culture, how do we operate sometimes in a covert way? Where does wisdom come in? And how do we connect with the culture? How do we build relationship? Even when people sometimes are asking the questions that the tendency is just coming right in and you want to answer. Oh, one other question that one of the people who is a homosexual who challenged me on this, and he says, you are saying that if you're a homosexual, you cannot go to heaven. And I know what he wanted to say with that. He was, again, trying to create this us against them. And so you're saying that we as homosexuals will go to hell? And all this argument came in. And that's not my argument. It's not my lane. It's like, if you're a heterosexual, will you get to heaven? I asked him. So what am I doing there? I'm not automatically doing us against them. Why? Because of that very thing is because we needed another conversation. But the conversation was already, he was going to try to get me, us against them by saying that all homosexual, that you Christians say, well, we go to hell. And he used certain scripture verses that said that, or that other believers have said that to him. And my heart is because I know the Father doesn't want anyone to perish. And as a result of that, my conversation is I say, because you're heterosexual doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to go to heaven. And then I got to have the conversation about Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but by him. Then we had an opportunity to talk and started to connect. And I was able to speak the language of love, and we connected. And then we were able to deal with some root issues that he was struggling with, even in regard to people that have misrepresented a God that looks like Jesus. So I'm just saying that the wisdom in this season sometimes needs to look like something so that we have an opportunity to connect with the world. And it is not to become like them, but to be able to understand the culture that you're ministering in. And it is very, very different than the culture that I was raised in. So when you're living in a culture where they don't even know the Bible, or you cannot use scripture verses, you cannot do all of those different things, how do you go in and change your classroom setting if you cannot talk about Jesus? How do you even equip your children in a classroom setting when you're realizing that they're the school teachers that will teach the student things that is totally contrary? And how is your kids supposed to be like a Daniel, like a Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, where they are actually taking and they are pretty much castrating 4 young teenagers, put them into occult training under Nebuchadnezzar, the most evil man of the day. Taking these teenagers, how do you get these teenagers in that kind of an environment where they are standing firm, but still loving well? How did they speak the language of love that eventually led to no compromise, and at the same time to becoming influencer that led that this maniac governmental leader that would actually build something for them to worship, and if not, he will throw them to the lions, or he put them into the fire, and we know the very story. How do we raise up sons and daughters that are resilient in the middle of all of this, that knows how to arise and shine, for the light has come? And how do you bring a Daniel in when the judgment coming against those leaders, and the tendency we will have from our religion says, I told you so, you deserved it. Don't you know what he did to me? Don't you know what he did to my family? He killed my family. And we have all the reason to do that. It just doesn't look like Jesus. But Daniel was different. They had a different type of spirit. Daniel went in when the judgment came against Nebuchadnezzar, and he had an opportunity to say that the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, the judgment was coming against him. Daniel was saddened. And Daniel said, I wish this was not for you, but this was against your enemies. Daniel had already learned how to practice the language of love, that eventually when God allowed the mind to be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar because of his evil, Daniel, when this Nebuchadnezzar started to come back to his senses, he came to Daniel that led to his conversion. Oh, there was another one, Nehemiah. He was such a cupbearer for his king. He honored his king. It doesn't matter what system this king is, but how do you know how to serve in such a way that when your heart is broken over what's broken in society, Nehemiah, as a cupbearer of the king, he knew covert revival. And he was able to do in 40 days what all the rest of it, if you could call it a church, the believers couldn't do in years. Or perhaps there is a Joseph, who was rejected by his father, sold as a slave by his brother, ended up in the pit. But instead of being pitiful in the pit, that a lot of people, they never got out of the pit test. Then he was falsely accused. He was sold as a slave, and falsely accused for something he never committed because he was pure. How do you handle that when you get falsely accused? When you are pure, not because you did something wrong, not because you reap what you're sowing. Joseph understood covert revival. And he went through this process in his life. And eventually, the very brothers that did this to him, Joseph said, he said, come a little bit closer. And he said to them, you didn't do this. God did this so I could bless you. It's called total forgiveness. It is living a lifestyle, because Joseph had gone through that pardon test. And then he saved the whole nation from starvation, because he had been growing into influence. It didn't matter where you put him, if that was in the pit, or if that was in a palace, if that was in a prison. He arose and shine in the middle of it, and he changed the environment because he was an environment changer. And sometimes you use words. So how do we learn to become thermostats that set the temperature in classroom, in governments, in businesses, wherever we are, because of the temperature that we are living in? These are the things that I've been fascinated with for at least 24 years. A couple of stories here and testimony connected to this very thing, because I'm just describing a little bit of covert revival and the language of love. Not just in the Old Testament. We see this with the Apostle Paul, how he even honored some of the false gods that was there. And you say, how can you do that, Paul? When you read about it, it was not that he honored just a false god, but he honored what these people would honor for the very purpose of connecting with them. And I just see in that Jesus is another one of my favorite examples. And there was overt and there was covert, the way he changed the environment, the way he dealt with people, changed people. And he is my ultimate hero in words, thoughts, and deed. Sometimes what you saw, first of all, everything came from love with Jesus, but sometimes you saw the power, other times you saw the wisdom. But love, power, and wisdom was one with Jesus. So major thing about ambassadors of love that knows the king well and knows the kingdom well. The culture that he has placed you in, for each one of us where he has placed you. For me, it's different when I'm with a Shia Muslim, that I just got a beautiful greetings today, or with a Sunni Muslim. I got another greeting, and I thought I was unique from the Saudi stream of Islam. So here's two different streams. Just recently, China is bringing them together. But two totally different streams. The way I speak in each one, I speak the language of love, but the way I express it is differently, because my responsibility is also to understanding the culture, context, where God has called me to arise and shine in. My responsibility when I speak is what they are hearing, what I'm saying, that this is the same thing. And it is very different from these two cultures. If I'm with my Jewish friends, if I'm with an atheist, or if I'm with, and I could just go on and on and on. This is what my heart and desire for every single one of us as believers is, to be able to represent King Jesus well. And understanding his calling, the lane that he has placed you to be in, what is your unique calling? But then from that very place, for you to learn the language of love, for you to learn, and what does this look like? One good way to start as a starting point, 1 Corinthians 13. And if you take these verses, if you are prophetic in nature, and then when you prophesy over somebody, love is patient. And 1 John 4:16, God is love. So are you patient with people? Love is kind. Is your prophecy motivated out of the kindness? Love does not envy. It does not boast, and etc. So you go to that beautiful characteristics, what love is, and see if your prophecy is immersed in the language of love. It gives a beautiful, beautiful definition of what love is, what God is. So you can put in God in instead of love. God is patient. God is kind. He doesn't. Then you put in your name instead. Leif is, is Leif really patient? Or is he really kind? Does he envy? Does he boast? And then you go to this list, and then you can start to see some of those areas that is not love. What is the number one thing that I need to practice right now where he has placed me? Maybe that's in your marriage. Maybe that's in your home. Maybe that's in your workplace. That is, I need an upgrade in patience here. And then asking the Holy Spirit for you to get some upgrade, but give you some areas where you need to grow in patience. For me, it could be traffic in Atlanta, parking at the airport of Atlanta, or even some of the people that can be difficult to love. So here we are in this school of covert revival, learning to speak the language of love. I just had Yazir and Aki, and you've heard a lot of stories lately from them. But there was a couple of areas where there was one person, Yazir was sitting with his boys. He was telling me this story again yesterday. And he was sitting with his sons, playing games and having fun. And an official came and knocked on the door and disturbed the family time. And this official was kind of an accusatory officer that just didn't make Yazir's life very well. So when I was visiting his country, it was described to me, and very upset with how could these people do and who do they think they are? I'm not going to compromise. There was just some of that came out. And then we just talked a little bit about what does the language of love look like in this setting? What do you do when somebody official? What do you do when that cop mistreated me? Are you going to be prejudiced against people that are prejudiced? Are you going to judge people that are judging you? And what is the difference with you? So we just talked through that. And I said, what would it look like when that official comes and said, hey, thank you so much for stopping by. And honor is what love looks like. This is part of the language of love. What if you honor somebody that dishonor you? And we started to go through the process. I'm so proud of my spiritual son because he got a new chance. And the next time he started to practice some basics of the language of love. So when the person was stopping by and disturbed, the first one thing he did, he said, would you forgive me? Last time you were here, I maybe had a right or felt I had a right, but that doesn't matter. You're an official here and I should have honored you. Would you forgive me? And it started a journey of a conversation. And now they started a relationship. And something starts to take place. They're able to connect. This is one of the big keys. And some people are afraid you're compromising if you do that. And no, it is wisdom that helps us to connect with people. So we have an opportunity to plant a seed of love so they can become a tree of love. We have an opportunity when you see the terrorist Saul to see the Apostle Paul and treat people based upon their destiny, not their history, because that you have learned how to do covert revival. And I just was thinking about, I was so proud of Yazir that he is now practicing that language. And while he is here, he's going to learn to buy some gifts. So when some people are coming to persecute him, yay, he has gifts ready to bless them. Why? Because that's the language of love. We bless the one that persecutes us, that comes against us. This is part of the things that starts to change environment when you start to be an environment changer. And that doesn't mean you do not compromise. You're connecting to people and you build relationship. You learn how to stand firm, but also how to love well. And when you speak the truth, you speak it in love. So if I would give you a glass with water, and I give you the glass, the first thing you touch is the glass. You speak the truth in love. The truth is the water, and the love is the glass. So the first people get is love, and then the truth is wrapped in love. That's what Jesus taught us to do. That's the language of love. That's connected to the covert. I'm not saying you should do the overt, but as a wisdom in this season is to know the difference. What is covert? What is overt? Another one, and some of you have heard this testimony before, but Aki came to me and had asked, and she shared about this beautician who's the best hair cutter in all of Havana. Made the women's hair so beautiful, but she said, I cannot go there because, first of all, I'm a Christian and a pastor's wife. But second of all, this lady is a witch, full of witchcraft, but she is a witch, real witch. And then again, I had coming in because we were learning about the language of love. And finally, when Aki said, what should I do in this situation? And I had told her, repent. I didn't remember the conversation we had, but we had a little conversation there that at least led Aki to coming in and saying, maybe I need to practice the language of love. Maybe the light in me is greater than the darkness around me. Instead of being afraid and I had told her that, what about, because she's like, if she touches my hair and comes in with demonic and spells, and what do I do? And say, it's kind of the story. If you touch the lepers, you become unclean. Instead, if the lepers touch you, they become clean. So Aki was a little resistant and reluctant. She went there for the first time, second time. I learned from Aki, I thought it was 1 year, but it was 2 years that she went there, build relationship, build trust, continue letting the light and love. And she thought after 2 years, when is this going to stop? In the school, as she is learning that love is patient. And I was visiting Cuba on an event. We had revival services, and she asked what we call the witch to come. Some of you have seen the video, the witch to worshiper, that we've recorded. But this witch eventually gave her life to Jesus, saved, healed, delivered. She is the worship leader, the most committed, have 8 lighthouses of love that she is leading right now. Just through starting with covert revival that led to overt revival, transformation, and now she's one of the most contagious people. I could sit here, tell story after story of people that tried to kill me, tried to stop me. I struggled with him. I had his justice and God. I mean, they deserve. And then eventually he started to teach me about the language of love. When I started to see them, he says, what do you see? And there's specifically one man that for years, he just intimidated me. For years, he falsely accused me. For years, this person, when I came to this country, he just created hostility towards me. And I really wanted judgment to come against him until I learned about the language of love, or was reminded, because I knew the language, that he wanted me to practice the language of love. At first, I realized that he is not the problem, I am the problem. Because the problem is never darkness, the lack of light. And I realized that the light in me was not greater than the darkness in him. I realized that I came from a place of fear, that I was going to get killed every time, instead of the perfect love in me hadn't cast out his fear. And as a result of that, we started a journey, and it was a journey until the very moment. And by the way, I just got the invitation yesterday, I think it was. I'm heading to his headquarters. And last time we were there, they just ride us in. First time it was on a horse, and the next time on a camel. And the way they now honor. Why? Because the environment has changed, and that changed what my environment changed. Because I started to learn to speak the language of love. And I know that many of you that are watching, many of you that are listening to this, it sounds a little bit weird and strange because you were not aware that there was such a thing as covert revival. You didn't know that there are sometimes that you do not have an opportunity just to see somebody saved or changed or delivered. But sometimes, like Jesus, the simplicity that I love about Jesus about this is you have a John. Jesus said, hey, come and follow me. And he was a lion. John, let's get fire from heaven. Let's have a little rage and a little anger. These people will not receive you. And a lot of us would say, yeah, if that would be Democrats or if that would Republic, whatever group you will put in there, the people that are coming against Jesus, here's how we respond. That's the natural way of responding. Congratulations, you are correct. It is the natural way, but it is not the Jesus way. It is not the language of love. That's speaking just the language that the rest of the world are familiar with, that when they are hostile towards you and they are attacking you and they are coming against you and the culture is coming against you, that you're either coming in a situation that's us against them and you're creating that, well, we're being persecuted because we do not know how to change environment. We do not know how to change atmosphere. We do not know how to be a lamb that sacrificed and laid on our life. What Barabbas deserves, I takes his place so he can become free. But Jesus started this process, and for the next 3 years, it was not just John, the temperamental that became the disciple who Jesus loved. But it took about 3 years in the journey to be together with Jesus. Jesus made them safe. He knew the language of love, even before John has become it. Even when Peter was there and Peter had all these different issues, Jesus was not finished. He was not easily offended. Even at the moment after Peter denied him, after Peter said that I would die for you, but Jesus knew that he is eventually going to deny. Jesus was different. And then eventually we know the story that came after the resurrection. Peter was not there on Friday. Peter fell asleep 3 times on the Thursday when he promised to be there with Jesus, and Jesus needed him. He was not there on the Saturday or Sunday. But when the women saw the resurrected Jesus, says, go and tell the disciple. And one translation says in Mark chapter 16, verse 6 and 7, and especially Peter. Why would Jesus say, and Peter, another translation said, why would he highlight Peter? Because this is what the language of love does. He hadn't seen even if Peter betrayed or rejected and did all of that. That's not how Jesus sees him. He saw a rock. He saw an unshakable. He saw somebody who's going to lead a move of God's Spirit, a courageous. And are you able to see that in the people that are still in the process? Jesus did. And Jesus was able to do that with a Peter that brought to the transformation of Peter. And this is what I'm learning from Jesus, a Judas. He didn't choose, and there's times you have a Judas, but Jesus still washed his feet. Jesus still entrusted him with money, knowing his weakness was money. And he made him the treasurer of the disciples. How can you do that to Jesus? Don't you know this guy has an issue, weaknesses? But love believes all things, hopes all things. Jesus was practicing the language of love. Judas made some choices, and the consequences was horrific. But it was not because he didn't have an opportunity. It was not that Jesus didn't love him well. We're not responsible how people are responding to it, but we are responsible. Are we loving well? Are we loving people without a hook? Are we speaking the language of love? And then from that love, are we full of power? Are we full of wisdom? Because even when we talk about this love, it is not a weakness. But if we do not have the power to do something with it and the wisdom, then we also have a weakness. It is like somebody with a cancer. You love on the person, but they still die on cancer. Somebody else have another issue, and all these people with issue, and you can love those people. But if we do not have the empowerment and the wisdom to make a difference, then it is important for us to come back and capture the fullness of the Holy Spirit, the fullness of Jesus, so that we can bring glory to the Father. So this is just a little framework. We're going to talk a little bit more about it, but you see it historically, you see it biblically, you see this example that I think that has helped me in a season when we're living in a culture where it is so easy to be offended. And I'm there a lot of times. So you know my chair message. I get in chair 2, but then I get back again to chair 1 where I belong. And I get to start to practice that language of love. And I get to be an influencer. And eventually, if we can make it hard for people to go to hell and easy for people to go to heaven, because they get to experience the language of love. That is the language the blind eyes can see and the deaf ears can hear. One more story that came to my spirit. Years ago, I had been visiting this Islamic university, and I met this scholar, and I was not ready. I was supposed to have had a gift because I bring gifts as an honor. And then I asked my coordinator, I said, Marcus, do I have anything? He said, you have one of your books, Seeing Through Heaven's Eyes. I still remember as I presented that gift, and it was a little risk-taking because it's a very clearly overt revival book, not so much of a covert revival. As I handed this book to him and I started to pray. Then later on, we left 24 hours afterwards, Marcus got a call and he gave the phone over to me. And this person started to describe waves and waves of love for 24 hours had come over him. He had an encounter with Jesus, with the love of Jesus. 6 months later, I found out that he died. And I'm so grateful in this moment that I didn't get offended. I'm so glad that I didn't have a wall up. I didn't go into the reason. I don't have whatever is needed to be able to meet his need. But instead of what you do not have, I found out what I had. And I found a little book that I took a little risk. Sometimes it is the loaves and fishes that feeds the multitude. Sometimes when Peter had to pay his taxes, all he has is a coin. But why did he find a coin in the fish's mouth? Because he is a fisherman. If you're a school teacher, if you're a writer, if you're a musician, God gives you certain things where you will find the very provision that is needed to be able to meet some of the needs that needs to be met. It is within the sphere where God has called you. So when you're hearing my story, I don't want you to try to be me, but I think that what I'm asking you to consider, that every single one of us can learn from Jesus to speak the language of love. We can all learn how to practice that language. And the simplicity of the framework today for me, if it is healing, put the love, 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4-7. Deliverance, same thing. Because the difference is, I'm going to get rid of that demon. And you do not care that much about the person, because self is in the center why you want to do what you're doing. Instead that you genuinely love this person that the enemy is coming against. What does that look like when you operate with a language of love towards a person being tormented by the demonic? It looks very differently. And usually there's very few manifestations because the enemy do not have an opportunity to humiliate somebody, a brother and a sister being tormented. So Father, I just thank you so much for just that I get to start to practice this language of love. Forgive me that so many times I speak a different language, so many times even listening to this language of this world. And this language of this world sometimes affect me more than I can affect them. Father, just remind me again about what love is.